sound of distant, mournful wind. Perhaps a low, resonant drumbeat fades in and out subtly behind the narration, barely perceptible. Imagine this, a single, unmarked pit. A pit so vast, so deep, it swallowed the lives of thousands. Not in one cataclysmic event, but in a systematic, brutal extermination. This wasn't a battlefield casualty. This was annihilation. And the year was 1857. We think we know the story of the Indian Mutiny. We've heard of the Sepoy Rebellion of Cawnpore, of the desperate struggles for freedom. But what if I told you there was a forgotten atrocity, a chapter so horrific, so deliberately erased from the popular narrative that it's known to very few? What if I told you about Bonner's mass grave? The year 1857. India, a jewel in the British crown, simmered with discontent. Decades of colonial exploitation, of religious insensitivity, of economic strangulation had pushed the Indian people, the sepoys, the farmers, the princes, to the brink. The sparks were numerous. The greased cartridges rumored to be smeared with animal fat offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers, the annexation of Oudh, the perceived erosion of ancient traditions. On May 10, 1857, the flame ignited in Meerut. Sepoys, refusing to use the cartridges, rose up against their British officers. They marched on Delhi, proclaiming the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, their leader. The rebellion spread like wildfire across the Gangetic Plain, engulfing cities like Lucknow, Jhansi, and Gwalior. The British response was swift, and it was savage. They saw this not as a legitimate uprising, but as a demonic insurrection, a threat to their very dominion. And their methods of suppression were designed not just to quell the rebellion, but to break the spirit of an entire civilization. We often hear of the retaliatory executions, the blowing of rebels from cannons, a particularly gruesome and humiliating end. But these were often individual acts, albeit horrific. What happened in the region around Bonner, a name that echoes with unspeakable horror in the few surviving accounts, was on a scale that chills the soul. The British, under commanders like General Henry Havelock and Sir Colin Campbell, sought to impose a brutal order. They advanced with overwhelming force, and their actions were not confined to the battlefield. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were razed to the ground. Any man found with a weapon, even a hunting knife, was summarily executed. But the true horror, the untold story, lies in the systematic elimination of entire communities. Historians who have dared to delve into the archives, who have pieced together fragmented dispatches and personal testimonies, speak of a deliberate policy of depopulation. The British sought to create zones of terror, areas where no Indian dared to live, no Indian could even breathe without fear. Consider the accounts of Lieutenant Colonel W.F. Tytler. In a dispatch dated August 24, 1857, he described the burning of villages and the indiscriminate killing of inhabitants. He noted, and I quote directly from his report, "We have been burning and shooting the natives with all sorts of cruelty." This wasn't just about battlefield victory. This was about punishment, about terror. But Bonner's mass grave represents something far more chilling. It's not a single event documented in a neat report. It's a culmination of a horrific strategy. As the British forces advanced, particularly in the aftermath of key rebel strongholds falling, they didn't just kill the combatants. They targeted the civilians. Women, children, the elderly, anyone perceived as being part of the supporting infrastructure of the rebellion, or simply as a future generation that might one day rise again. The method was terrifyingly efficient. Captured villagers, often rounded up from their homes, were not given trials. They were not even interrogated in any meaningful sense. They were marched to predetermined locations, and then they were killed, en masse. The documentation is sparse, deliberately so. The British military, keen to present a narrative of order and justice, even in suppression, would not have readily recorded such barbarity. But whispers persisted. Accounts from Indian survivors pieced together over decades speak of vast pits. pits dug with a singular purpose, to bury the evidence and the bodies. The name Bonner itself likely refers to a British officer, or perhaps a location where these atrocities were concentrated. It's a geographical marker for a crime against humanity that was designed to be forgotten. The official records might speak of casualties in battles, of rebels killed in skirmishes, but they are silent on the deliberate, cold-blooded extermination of entire communities. How did they do it? It was a chillingly simple yet devastatingly effective process. As British columns swept through the countryside, they would identify villages that had supported the rebellion even passively. The inhabitants would be rounded up, their homes looted and burned to further instill terror. Then they would be marched to a designated spot. Large pits would be dug, sometimes by forced labor from surviving villagers or by soldiers themselves. And then the killing would begin. Methods varied. Sometimes it was indiscriminate firing squads. Other times it was more brutal. I've read accounts that speak of villagers being forced into the pits and then artillery fire being directed into them. Imagine the horror, the sound, the screams, the sheer, unimaginable terror. The scale is what's most difficult to comprehend. We're not talking about dozens or even hundreds. The evidence, though fragmented, suggests thousands. Thousands of men, women, and children, extinguished in a single act of brutal retribution. Why is this story so untold? Because it challenges the very foundation of the British imperial narrative. It contradicts the image of benevolent rulers bringing civilization to a benighted land. It exposes the raw, unvarnished truth of colonial power, its capacity for immense cruelty, its willingness to commit unspeakable acts in the name of maintaining control. The historians who have tried to uncover this truth have faced immense challenges. Records were destroyed, both by the British themselves and by the passage of time. Indian accounts were often dismissed as propaganda or exaggerated tales of woe. The very act of silencing these stories was part of the colonial strategy. To bury the bodies was one thing. To bury the memory, to erase the shame, was equally crucial. But memory, though suppressed, can endure. The oral traditions of India, passed down through generations, hold fragments of these stories. They speak of villages that vanished, of families that were wiped out without a trace, of a silence that fell over once thriving communities. The significance of Bonner's mass grave is not just in its scale, but in its intent. This was not about collateral damage. This was about collective punishment. This was about sending a message so brutal, so absolute, that any future descent would be met with utter annihilation. It was a calculated act of terror designed to break the will of a nation. And for a long time it worked. The memory of 1857, of the mutiny, was a complex one for Indians. It was a story of bravery, of resistance, but also of immense suffering and brutal suppression. The story of Bonner's mass grave, of the systematic extermination, was a wound too deep, too raw to be publicly acknowledged by many, for fear of reigniting that pain, or for fear of the continued power of the narrative that sought to erase it. But to truly understand the path to Indian independence, to understand the deep-seated animosity that fueled the freedom struggle for the next 90 years, we must confront these uncomfortable truths. We must acknowledge the darkness that lay beneath the veneer of empire. The British Empire built its dominion on a foundation of blood and bones, and in places like Bonner, that foundation was laid with the lives of innocent civilians, deliberately erased from history. It was a war of attrition, yes, but it was also a war of annihilation. The absence of grand monuments, the lack of official recognition, the very silence surrounding Bonner's mass grave speaks volumes. It tells us that some stories are deemed too inconvenient, too damning to be told. But history, like water, finds its way, and the truth, however buried, eventually surfaces. Bonner's mass grave. It is a scar on the conscience of history, a chilling testament to the brutal realities of empire. And it serves as a stark reminder that the cost of subjugation is measured not just in lost battles, but in extinguished lives, in silenced voices, and in the deliberate erasure of entire chapters of human suffering. As we remember 1857, let us not just recall the courage of the rebels, but also the unspeakable terror inflicted upon the innocent. For it is only by confronting the totality of the past, the light and the profound darkness, that we can truly learn and ensure that such horrors are never again allowed to be buried or forgotten.